I want you to imagine for a moment that every child, no matter what community they come from or the family they're born into, is able to realize their full human potential. Imagine them working at the most cutting-edge companies or nonprofits, trying to figure out how to solve humanity's greatest challenges. 16 million children in this country living in poverty with so much potential. They are the children that I work with, the children of factory workers and gardeners, housekeepers, truck drivers, the unemployed, the underemployed. Like every single one of us, they need somebody to believe in them. I grew up in a Mexican-American family that was constantly moving from place to place. I think it was my parents' attempt to always try to find a place that was a little safer than the last. There was my older brother and my middle sister, and then I was the youngest. And my older brother and I were very different. Our styles were different. He wore Pendletons and khaki pants, and I wore those orange tough-skin pants with the Geronimo shoes. He had real tattoos, and I had the tattoos that you would typically find in a Cracker Jack box. And I never really knew the real names of his friends: Jaws, Thumper, Termite, and Deadman, and he wasn't even really dead. And by no means are they to be confused with Disney characters. My friends used they used their real names, Mike, Sean, and Joseph. Yes, my brother and I were very different, but I know that he absolutely deeply cared about me, and he would often tell me, "I want you to be better than me." December 8th, 1980. That night, John Lennon was tragically assassinated in New York City. Earlier that day, I was preparing for my very first Boy Scout meeting. And I remember hearing my mom on the phone, and I could tell that she was distressed. And shortly after she got off the phone, I remember we turned on the television, and it was 5 p.m., and the anchor came on. Breaking news: 4 young men from the San Fernando Valley were arrested for a series of crimes. One by one, he announced the names, and all I heard was my brother's name. I couldn't make sense of it. Here I was going to my very first Boy Scout meeting, and my brother was lying in jail. It was the first day of what has now been 34 years in prison. He was 18, I was 10, 8 years apart. While he was trying to survive, I was trying to figure out how to live and dream. For many years, I felt a really strong sense of shame that I had a brother in prison. So in fact, just being able to talk to you here is like therapy for me, and I appreciate that opportunity. But one of the things that I knew is I knew I couldn't be broken. I couldn't allow whatever struggles my brother had to affect me because I didn't want to disappoint my parents. I had to remain resilient. And so I did the only thing that I knew I could do. I did well in school, and I did well enough to go to and graduate from college. And so today, while my brother lies or is in a California prison, I work with an amazing group of young people at an organization called Bright Prospect. These are low-income kids who have dreams of being at a place like the Claremont Colleges. There are institutions like Harvard, Yale, Swarthmore, Stanford, the Claremont Colleges, Cal Poly, and they're doing some amazing things. And I often ask myself, why is it that my brother, why is it that he and I went in completely different directions? These things are complex, but this is what I do know. My brother grew up in a household where my parents were constantly struggling financially, and they were constantly fighting, and he witnessed things that no child should ever have to experience. He attended schools where simply for having a Spanish surname was placed in remedial classes. So he never wanted to be at school or at home, so the streets became his home. And that's where he found other young men who felt the very same way. And they became a crew, and then a gang, and they came together for what you might say for all the wrong reasons. History is instructive. My parents grew up at a time where Mexican Americans had few professional opportunities. And if it hadn't been for the civil rights victories of the 1960s, my father, who at 31, he was working for a place called Head Start, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. He was handling invoices. And the director of the program, who was a professor at the time at a place called San Fernando State, now called Cal State Northridge, told him, young man, why don't you go to college? I think you can do this. I believe you can do this. That man believing in my father not only changed his life, but it transformed my childhood. I remember as a kid, my dad had this 1965 VW red bus van. And I remember leaving our neighborhood of San Fernando and going to this place called USC. And I remember that it looked a lot different than the neighborhood I grew up in. The grass was green, the buildings were tall, and I remember going up to the tallest building, and it looked like Earth was on top of the building. It turns out later, I think it's just a sculpture on top of the building. But when you're a 5-year-old kid, you don't know. And I remember coming out of that building thinking, well, I had Legos in one hand, and I had building blocks in the other, and for some reason, and I'm not sure why this was, I walked out wearing a Mexican sombrero. And I realized at that moment, I'm going to college because they give you things. Knowledge wasn't high on the list when I was a 5-year-old, and I've come to understand that it's much bigger today. You know, my parents will be the first to tell you they didn't get it right with my brother, but they tried to get it right with me. And so they did something really important. They connected me to a community of resources, to a community of people. You've heard of them. The Boys and Girls Club. I was a Cub Scout. I was a Weeblo Scout. Little League Baseball. And these adults who were in my life played an instrumental role in helping shape who I am. They picked me up when I fell. They believed in me. And those people made all the difference in my life. I believe that was one of the things that was absent in my brother's own life. Today, my team and I work with over 1,600 students, 1,000 at 7 different high schools, and 600 at colleges and universities all over the country. And they're doing some amazing things. And one of the things I'm incredibly proud of is that any student can join the program at the end of their 9th grade year. So you don't have to have a high GPA to be in this program, although we do have kids who have a 4.7 GPA. Can't even begin to understand what that means. When you talk about the influence of one's story on one's life, my brother had a tremendous influence on the work I do. My team and I developed a program called Crews, as in my crew, the people I hang with this idea of raising friendship to a higher level. And I want you to think about that for a moment, how important that is, particularly in low-income communities, on the people that you hang with, right? Does that matter? And every one of our kids learns the value of teamwork, and they learn that even though they come from a family and a high school campus, that by telling their stories, they see the connection that they have with each other. And even though one might have red hair or green hair, and one might listen to hip hop or rock and roll, that when they hear them tell their story, when they tell their stories to each other, they're able to connect and see, wow, you're going through the very same things that I'm going through. And it starts to build, in my view, a community mindset, which is so, so important in the communities that I work in. Every crew has a crew leader that's willing to step up and take on the additional responsibility. They're building community, and it's working. Our kids are improving their grades. They're joining clubs and organizations and taking on leadership positions. They're getting involved in the community. They're going to college, and they're graduating. 90% of our students graduate from college, which is pretty unheard of in low-income communities. The heart of our program is our kids. And one of them is a young lady who will be graduating from high school this year. And when I first met her, she'll be the first to tell you that she was a very lost and insecure young woman. Her parents, essentially her home life was a wreck, as she described it to me. Her parents were constantly fighting. And I believe she really thought that she began to lose hope. And then something changed at the end of her sophomore year. I met her between the summer of her freshman and sophomore year at our summer academy program. And something changed. And I'm not even going to begin to try to tell you what she said, so I'm just going to read it from this very convenient card that I have in front of me. And this is what she said. As she described it to me, "You really made me feel comfortable and welcome. After I gave my speech at the crew leader training, I remember right before I left, you stopped me and told me that you were proud of me. I didn't think much of it until the next meeting. When I saw you, I was going to give you a handshake, but then you looked at me like if I was a maniac and gave me a hug. And you looked me in the eyes and stated again how proud you were of me for the other day. I don't think you will ever know how I felt to hear those words, to know that you remembered me from the other day. Those words meant everything to me. You believed in me. You told me that you were proud of me, and you didn't even know me. You said it like as if you really meant it, and that is something that my own father has never told me." Us believing in this young lady empowered her. She stepped up to be a crew leader for her friends. And it wasn't easy at first. She attended some monthly trainings, and she grew, and she learned the importance of trust, and she learned how to work through conflict. And every single one of her friends are going to be going to college, and I have no doubt that they're going to graduate from college. They learn some important things. They learn the importance of asking for help. They learn the importance of when you start something, you finish it. They learn the importance of relationships, right? Of how you actually treat people. And all of them will be the first in their families to go to college. I am incredibly, incredibly proud of her and what she has done for her crew and what she is doing for her community. By the way, I wrote her, Mr. Gates, if you're watching, I wrote her a recommendation for the Gates Millennium Scholarship, so I hope you don't mind the little plug. I've learned a lot of things in the 15 years that I've worked with low-income communities, but this is one of them, is who they hang with matters. And yet, when we talk about public education reform, we'll talk about curriculum, we'll talk about testing, we'll talk about everything but these kids and the power that every single one of them has to actually transform their schools. We don't do anything around putting these kids and building these teams of kids who really want to see change in their community. I would like to add that to the discussion on public education reform, if anyone's listening. I almost didn't make it to Bright Prospect. A week before I was given the offer, I went to the hospital for some blood work, and I remember having to spend the night at the hospital. And I remember my nurse walking in. She walked in and she said, I asked her, "What's going on? I'm staying here too long." And she goes, "The doctor hasn't talked to you." And I go, no, the doctor hasn't talked to me. And she goes, "Well, we think you have leukemia." And after I got over the initial shock, I asked her, "Well, do people survive leukemia?" And she said, "They do." And that's all I needed to hear. And so I was there for a month. And really my only long-term chance at survival was to have a bone marrow transplant. And the chances of finding a match are quite low. So I remember coming back one day from having visited my students, having not seen them since I was admitted to the hospital. And I remember coming home and I had a message. And when you're a cancer patient, you're always worried to see messages because you're never sure whether you're dying or you're living or what the results are, if you relapse, right? It's such a very nerve-wracking experience. And it didn't help that my doctor spoke in a monotone. So, yeah. And so I remember listening to the message, and he goes, "Hello, Tim. This is Dr. Patel. And I was sort of suspended in a state, just suspended. I have good news for you. Your brother is a bone marrow match. My brother in prison was going to be in a position to save his little baby brother's life. I can't tell you how meaningful that was to him, given the life that he had lived. But after we got over the initial joy, the prison warden said, 'No, we are not going to release him.' And I don't mean release like in, hey, listen, we let him out the front door and he walks over to the hospital. I'm not talking in shackles and in a police escort. So I went over to a woman's house that I had worked on her campaign for city council. And I asked her, because her mom was our state senator, and she calls her mom, and the mom goes, "Why don't you talk to your brother, Tom?" Well, it turns out that Tom was on the board of the Department of Corrections. He was the boss of the warden. So on a Tuesday, he was told, "My brother, you're not going." And on a Wednesday, the guard came up to him and goes, "I don't know who you know, but pack your things." And my brother went over to a place called UC San Diego La Jolla, and a week later, I was admitted into City of Hope, and I had a bone marrow transplant, and I was there for 2 months, and I've been cancer-free ever since. My brother and I often talk about what that means, because a lot of his friends ended up dead, including that young man I mentioned before, dead man. And to think that he had to make this sacrifice so that I could live, I can't tell you how much that's meant to the both of us. You know, I tell my story with our kids because they need to hear that no matter what your circumstances are, that you can achieve things. You can have success. You don't have to let those things be barriers. You know, we are the beneficiaries of the civil rights victories of the 1960s that opened the door for people like me, my father, and the kids I work with. There was a belief that no matter the color of your skin or the community you grew up in, that you should have the opportunity to dream and live. I'm forever thankful for that opportunity. Yet today, for many, in my view, it is a door that is rapidly closing. We can't afford to move backwards. We have to continue to believe in those people who never made it through the door or those who are edging closer to it. I believe it is in every single one of us to make that happen. I am incredibly hopeful for the future. In May 2012, I was asked to speak about our cruise program at the first Gang Prevention and Intervention Conference in Los Angeles. And after the talk was over, a young man came up to me, and he said, because I was telling him about our story and cruise and mentioned my brother, and he came up to me and he goes, "Hey, your brother by chance wouldn't be Vince, would he?" And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Yeah, I was locked up with him in Soledad. Man, he was a good handball player." And we hugged, we laughed, and then we hugged. It turns out that young man had spent 20 years of his life for something he didn't do. And the LMU Restorative Center represented him and got him out of prison. 20 years of his life. They believed in him. So I did something that I often tell our students to do when you need help. I said, you got to ask for help. You can't do it all by yourself. So I asked for help, and I asked one of the panelists, I said, do you know somebody that I can talk to who might be able to help my brother at an upcoming parole hearing? This was in 2013. And he connected me, Seth connected me to this woman named Barbara, an angel, this ethics lawyer. Angel, ethics lawyer. I'm not sure if that's an oxymoron, but anyways. And Barbara helped my brother, and she coached him and supported him and prepped us as a family. And then October 24th at 1:30 was his appointment at Donovan State Prison. And I remember being at work, waiting and wondering what was going to happen. At 4:58 p.m., Barbara calls, and she said, "He's coming home. Vince is coming home." Barbara believed in my brother. Bright Prospect believed in Paula. Warren, the director of Head Start, believed in my father. My community believed in me. We all need somebody to believe in us. Thank you.